few minutes before we should begin our Mariv service, and that always gives me a little chance for a chat. Well, I say chat, I mean study. If you turn back to page 196, you know, all of you are sitting at the back, and I'm not sure why. You're welcome to sit further to the front if you like, but I can come to meet you, and the people on live stream won't see anything but the top of my head, but at least they can still hear me. But I like to be able to actually see faces, not just shapes. Aleinu is now at the end of every Ashkenazic service. Not so in the Sephardic world, and if Joseph were here, who's just been studying the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic liturgy, we could go into that. But where did Aleinu originate? Let's see if people were paying attention earlier today. Because this is not the birthplace of Aleinu. The end of the service was not what it was originally composed for. I hope you all are aware that our tefillot are all compositions. They are poetic expressions written by different sages at different times, and Aleinu is just like all of the others. I like to say this is the greatest hit medley whenever you look at the Siddur. Certainly many other prayers have been uttered, but these are the ones that have survived the test of time. So Aleinu was originally composed with a very different goal in mind than just the conclusion of the service. Not the Avodah, you're close, but it is during another very special Musaf service. Hint, today's. Malchuyot, the section of the Musaf service for Rosh HaShanah, the longest Musaf service of the entire year, give or take, depending upon how fast you daven certain parts of Yom Kippur's liturgy. By text, I believe it is the longest. Contains Aleinu, at least as we know it, the paragraphs of Aleinu. It is generally believed to be about 2,000 years old, written probably in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And it was written for that section, the Malchuyot section of the Musaf Amidah for Rosh Hashanah. Now, the Talmud tells us that we are going to have these 3 sections of the Musaf Amidah that are completely irregular. It's normal, of course, to have the 3 opening blessings of the Amidah, to have the 3 closing blessings of the Amidah, and on a festival or Shabbat, to have one in the middle that has the essence, the iyun of that day. And we get that for Rosh Hashanah. But wait, there's more, says our ad rep. We get 3 additional blessings. Those are the 3 sections for which we blow the shofarot, which is probably the easiest way to call them to mind. And they are Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot. Malchuyot is about God's Malchuyot, God's kingship, and the Zichronot is about God's remembrance of us as his people, and Shofarot is about the sounding of the shofar and the impact that has on us. Aleinu was written for the first of those 3, for Malchuyot. Why? What does Aleinu tell us about God as Melech, God as our sovereign? Have you ever read Aleinu? See, this is, I find, a common problem. If you have a prayer that people know really, really well in Hebrew, odds are they've never bothered to look at the English. If you have a prayer that people don't know the Hebrew for, odds are they're following along in the English because they can't follow along in the Hebrew. It is a very unfortunate and ironic paradox that the most familiar prayers to most synagogue goers are the ones they understand the least, and the ones they are least familiar with are the ones they understand the most. So, what is the content of Aleinu? What is it talking about? Recognition of the kingship of God. But what does it mean for the kingship of God? And this is a tricky question, even more so, because the first paragraph is all about recognizing that God is God and that we have a special place within the great diversity of humanity of relating to God in this unique way. That's what all those initial lines are before we actually do our bowing. And then we go on, Shehunat Shamayim, to talk about how amazing and great God is. Obviously the ruler of the entire universe, because God created the world and there is nothing comparable or anything like God at all in existence. And then we go into the last paragraph, and that's actually the meat of the Aleinu, and gets ignored too often. The Alkein Dekaveh. What are we hoping for? What do we mean by God is king, or God will be king? Yemei Mashiach, the age of the Messiah, that will bring together all of humanity and get rid of evil. It's actually pretty straightforward. But when we say that we are waiting for God's kingship, for that to be the case, there is unfortunately a tendency to feel that this is a passive moment, that we wait for God's kingship, that eventually God will be king. Like God's not king right now? I mean, is God waiting for the invitation? Is this like Charles III and he's waiting for his official coronation? Isn't God already king? Well, yes and no. And this is part of rabbinic theology that sometimes gets glossed over because it's complicated. So if you'll bear with me for a little bit, it may sound a little bit like sophistry, but the rabbis have a very real point. God is king, absolutely. That's what the whole first half of Aleinu is telling us, that God is king and we are God's subjects. After all, there is nothing like God in all of the world that could be considered king beyond God, so of course, God is king. But is God recognized as king? The rabbis asked the very philosophical question long before philosophy was a going concern and people could get paid for it. Is a king if no one calls them king? It's like if the tree falls in the forest and no one is around, does it make a noise? If God is king but no one recognizes God as king, is God still king? If Charles III walks through the middle of some town and stops by a cafe and orders a cup of coffee, tea, and no one recognizes him as king, at that moment, is he king? Or is he just some guy with big ears ordering tea? It's a rather important question to ask about sovereignty in general, but all the more so to ask about God. Not that we can deny God's sovereignty or God's kingship, but that we can recognize that oftentimes the world, and even us as individuals, fail to act in a way that recognizes God as king, because if we recognize God as king in that moment, we wouldn't have done what we did. This is what Rosh HaShanah is trying to remind us. Yes, we all made mistakes, and one of the reasons we make those mistakes is because at that moment, we are failing to recognize God as king, that God gave us rules that would prevent us from making that mistake, from being the jerk that we were. And if we had been thinking of God as king at that moment, then you better believe it, we wouldn't have done it. Which means God is king and God isn't king. God is absolutely king in the heavens, but it is up to us to make sure that God is recognized as king here on earth. And it is only when we and the rest of the world make that recognition, to know God, as that final paragraph of Aleinu says, that evil will be swept away. Not because we will force people to have that recognition. We're not going out with inquisitions. We're not having a holy word or crusade or jihad. But we are spreading knowledge. And we spread knowledge by showing the impact of acting as God is king. If you act in a godly way, if you engage in this world showing this is what a life looks like, when a person draws closer and closer to a perpetual state of awareness of God as sovereign, and people see the beauty of that life, then they become attracted to God as well. And they come to recognize God's place in their life, and together we recognize God in the world, and God is no longer incognito in the cafe ordering a cup of tea. God instead is recognized as being Melech, as being king all around. Now that message is incredibly powerful in Rosh Hashanah, which is why it was composed for this day. But the Ashkenazim, I think, were onto something. That this is a message that is more powerful than just for Rosh Hashanah, that it needs a wider audience, that it needs to be reminded daily. And as such, Aleinu has migrated to be sprinkled throughout all of our services. And thank God, because it's another beautiful way to make sure that we don't lose sight of what God is, and we also don't lose sight of the active role we play in bringing redemption. Act as though God is your king, and the world gets better. All of us do that. Redemption has already occurred. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.